The Theory of Everything by Dr. Alon Giladi.
Article 1. Introduction to the Stars and Back. In 50 to 100 years, and perhaps even before, man will be able to embark on an interstellar journey and return. When I talk about interstellar travel, I do not mean a journey to the stars of the kind proposed today, but a journey beyond real cosmic boundaries, from one end of the Milky Way galaxy to the other, between Earth and Andromeda, and even between the ends of the universe. Such an ability to undertake a journey that today seems unimaginable does not stand on its own. It gives humanity access to tread not only the path of rational science, in accordance with the principles of scientific inquiry, but also the path of rational morality and rational faith. For even now, with the power available to humanity, it is marching toward an abyss. This article seeks to point out on the beginning of another path, not to the abyss, but to the stars. It should be emphasized, therefore, the journey to the return of the stars outside in it begins first and foremost with the stars inside, with the stars within us. The success of the journey, therefore, depends on the rational, exemplary, and universal path, both in rational science, rational morality, and rational faith, with the stars that lie at the foundations of all things. Article 2. To the stars. Breaking, questioning, leading. About 160 years ago, an extraordinary book was written by an American author named Dodge. The period in which the book was written is loaded with meaning. The end of the American Civil War in 1865. A war that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. The author dedicated this book not to the United States of America, but rather to a place far from it, Holland. At the center of the story are a brother and sister, the Brinker brothers, Hans Brinker and his sister, children of a poor family who tell stories to each other and to their friends. One of these stories is the story known as the Harlem Hero, which deals with an 8-year-old boy whose name is not given and was later attributed, apparently in retrospect, to Hans Brinker himself. According to the story, the boy goes out of town to the other side of the dam to bring cakes to a blind man. After he hands over the cakes and sets off on his way back, he notices a small trickle of water seeping through the dam. With the wonderful intuition of an 8-year-old child, he understands that if the trickle continues, the dam will burst, and the entire city will be flooded with a huge flood. The sea will break through the barrier designed to protect it. In an extraordinary act of heroism, the nameless child climbs the embankment, approaches the dam, and sticks his finger into the tiny breach, thus stopping the flow that could lead to a huge disaster. During the cold night, he cries out for help, but no one hears him. No one comes. Only at dawn does one of the local residents notice him, call for help, and the city is saved. As part of the story, one of the children points out to the others that this is a well-known and famous story, one that no one in the world does not know. The anonymous child represents the soul of the nation, a soul of heroism, of initiative, of action that stops the small trickle before it becomes a disaster. The sea, or nature, or in another reading, the wrong structure in front of them, do not flood the city, do not destroy humanity, because a moral little boy, with pure observation, dared to stop in time. The story of the Dutch boy who saves an entire city from the forces of nature echoes a deep and familiar motif. A little boy drives them. This is a well-known motif in human culture in general, and in the culture of rational faith in general, and in the Israeli faith in particular. Thus, in the well-known prophecy of Isaiah in chapter 11, a vision is described in which a shoot will come out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch will flourish from his roots, and upon it rests the Spirit of Jehovah, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of counsel and might, a spirit of knowledge and the fear of Jehovah. The spirit of rational ascension does not rest on superficial hearing or on the sight of the eyes, but on proof, on reason, on supreme intelligence. Then the immortal sentence appears, and righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. And the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard with the kid, and a little child shall lead them. In Israeli popular culture, a clear expression of the same motif can also be found in a well-known song by the Nahal, a youth pioneer group from the early 1970s, In a Red Dress. This song, whose lyrics were written by Ruth Sefruni and whose music was composed by Yair Rosenblum, centers on a seemingly innocent little girl who asks one question: why? Among other things, it says, "In a red dress and two braids, a little girl, alone and innocent, stood and asked why." And in contrast, "And all the volcanoes, and all the storms, and all the lions, and all the tigers, and all the great ones, and all the wise ones, stood pale-faced and found no answer." These images directly echo Isaiah's vision, a world of immense, violent, and powerful forces standing without an answer in the face of one simple question posed by the pure, clean mind. The motif of the question of why, combined with the motif of an answer that goes beyond convention, is a necessary condition for the forward march of all of humanity, not just on one level, but on all levels of thought, in rational science, rational morality, and rational faith. This is in contrast to the current path of humanity, which is marching without rational faith, without rational morality, and, as will become clear later, without rational science. Article 3. Wonders and Miracles and Other Vegetables. The Foundations of the Einsteinian Era. Almost exactly 120 years ago, a young 26-year-old student was working for the patent office in Zurich, Switzerland. He had just completed a degree in physics, a degree that in modern terms is probably equivalent to a combination of a bachelor's and master's degree. At the same time, he was required to complete his doctoral thesis in some field. In these conditions, the young man found time to write 4 articles. These 4 articles made him one of the most famous figures of the 20th century and gave the year 1905 its well-known nickname, the Year of Wonders. In that year, Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity appeared on the map of history. When looking at these 4 papers, it becomes clear that the 4th paper, the shortest of them, is the one that contains the most famous formula associated with Einstein: energy, E, equals mass, m, times the speed of light, c squared. This formula, which is most commonly associated with the special theory of relativity, is not accurate even according to Einstein's own method. At this point, it is worth noting a key fact. The Nobel Prize in Physics was not awarded to Einstein for the theory of relativity, but for another of the 4 papers, the one dealing with the photoelectric effect. In this paper, Einstein showed that light is not a continuous phenomenon, but operates in frequencies, in quantities, in quanta. In the special theory of relativity, Einstein argued that the time of a body moving at speed varies, as does space. In other words, the traveler's time is lengthened and his space is shortened, relative to a stationary observer. This is the heart of the sensational innovation of the special theory of relativity. Time is not fixed, space is not fixed. Both change. Between the formulation of the special theory of relativity in 1905 and the formulation of the general theory of relativity in 1915, Albert Einstein's "much water in the Jordan" passed, in a borrowed phrase. This water passed through a central and well-known station, the thought of his teacher, Hermann Minkowski. Minkowski determined that after the publication of the special theory of relativity, we are now in a new reality of space-time. When Einstein heard the blood, he called it with a certain disdain mathematician's geometry, an expression of reservation and even disdain. However, after years of intellectual debate and conflict with mathematicians, a field that was not central to his early work, Einstein arrived at the general theory of relativity in 1915. According to this theory, the universe is not governed by gravity in the classical sense, but rather exists as a structure of space-time that warps in the presence of mass and energy. Space-time itself becomes, according to this view, the fundamental structure of the entire universe. Article 4. The fundamentals of quantum error. In parallel, and to a large extent simultaneously, with the development of the special theory of relativity, and then the general theory of relativity, quantum theory, or quantum mechanics, also developed. As noted above, already in the 1905 article dealing with the photoelectric effect, Einstein referred to light as a quantum, not as a continuous phenomenon, but as a phenomenon of packets, of quanta. However, within the framework of his central theories, that is, the special and general theories of relativity, he saw reality as a continuous reality. The two elements that underlie these theories are, ostensibly, the existence of deterministic laws of physics, the existence of fixed and universal laws of nature, and at the same time, the constancy of the speed of light, which does not change. However, when they tried to apply the theory of relativity to the elementary components, to the small reality in the atom, in the electron, in the proton, and later with the development of the quantum picture, in quarks, in gluons, in bosons of various kinds, including in the W and Z particles, and in the Higgs, it became clear that the theory of relativity does not fit with that reality, with the reality of the small particles. The theory of relativity was understood, ostensibly, as being suitable for speeds close to the speed of light, but it does not fit with the tiny reality of the elementary particles. In this reality, quantum mechanics claimed the existence of completely different laws, the existence of uncertainty, the existence of chance, the phenomenon of a particle that is both a wave and a particle, a reality in which it is not possible to reach precise results, but only probabilities. Thus, it is claimed that this is a reality that is not continuous, but quantum, a reality that is not universal, and so on and so forth. Thus, a deep tension has been created between the two central theories of modern science since 1905 and onwards, the theory of special and general relativity versus the theory, or mechanics, of quantum. The attempts of scientists since the development of these two central theories have focused mainly on finding a theory of everything, a single theory that would combine both quantum mechanics and the theory of special and general relativity into one complete theory of the universe. All of these attempts have failed miserably. No attempt has matched reality. No attempt has succeeded to this day. And the main reason why these attempts have not succeeded is very simple. Because science has ceased to be a rational science, a science of proof and refutation, and has become something else. From a science that operates according to the principles of science as formulated by Karl Popper, the principle according to which a theory is valid as long as it has not been refuted, and if it does not fit reality, it must be refuted and another theory found. Science has become a subjective religion, a cult, the Einstein cult, versus the quantum cult, the Einstein religion versus the quantum religion. This phenomenon can be seen again and again. Why? Because when the special and general theories of relativity do not get along with reality, they create a new reality, a reality that did not exist and was not created. These two central theories do not get along with reality, not only in the quantum dimension, not only in the reality of small particles, but also in the great reality of the vastness of the universe. At the beginning of the universe, in the greatest story of all, the story of the Big Bang. The theory of relativity does not get along with the Big Bang, not with the expansion of the universe, nor with black holes. When scientists saw that it didn't fit, that it fell apart in the face of observations, that it led to numbers that didn't make sense, such as a singular point at the center of a black hole that became infinitely massive, or the lack of an explanation for the universe not collapsing as it seemingly expands, they invented additional components and incorporated them into the theory of relativity. For example, the concept of dark matter was introduced, a concept that had never been proven, that had never been observed, and that was simply added to save a theory that didn't fit with reality. And the same pattern can be seen not only in Einstein's theory or cult, but also in the theory or cult of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics doesn't fit with the fundamental laws of physics. It advocates uncertainty, a parallel reality of a particle and a wave, of a particle that is both a wave and neither a wave nor a particle. It posits a reality that is initially impossible to know precisely, a reality of probability, a reality according to which the observer supposedly determines reality, and not that the observer explains the existence he perceives. It claims coincidences, and so on, and at the same time repeatedly designs new particles, which come and disappear as if they were not there, in order to continue to hold on to its erroneous model. Furthermore, not only does it not fit with the laws of physics, but it also does not hold true to the reality beyond the dimension of small particles. Beyond a certain limit, a very small limit, it simply ceases to be valid. It does not fit the rest of the universe. This results in a situation in which the two central teachings of modern science, its two founding theories, are refuted in their content. They do not fit with the laws of physics. They do not fit with observations. And what do scientists do to this day when the theories do not fit with observations? They invent additional materials, add components to equations that have no connection with the observations themselves. Additional particles are invented. The quark particle, which has never been observed and has in fact never been proven. The gluon particle, whose very nature, as will become clear later, contradicts itself. Additional particles to describe the so-called weak force, W and Z, the Higgs particle, which supposedly constitutes mass, and many more components which in fact never existed and were not created, and even attempts are made to unify these two theories. Unity from nowhere to nowhere. And when we try to unify two theories that do not fit with either physics or observations, where do we end up? Do we end up with a theory of everything? No. In the end, we end up with nowhere. Article 5. Back forward to the theory of everything in being. And if I continue the same rationale regarding the greatest question of all in science, how will we arrive at the theory of everything in being? I answer, we will arrive at the theory of everything if we take one step back and correct the erroneous developments that are based on the erroneous theories of special relativity, general relativity, and quantum mechanics. I am already saying this explicitly. From what is called the Einsteinian project of special and general relativity, neither relativity nor the concept of space-time, nor the idea of the curvature of space-time will remain. What will remain is the photoelectric effect, and part of the formula that establishes a connection between energy, mass, and the speed of light, and nothing else. From the quantum mechanics project, uncertainty will not remain, nor the idea of a particle that is also a wave, nor coincidences, nor the stories of the observer who decides what reality is, and so on. What will remain is the quantum itself, the portions, the frequencies that are not the exclusive domain of light. This, and nothing more, is what will remain of quantum mechanics. And if you tell me you claim that all the foundations of modern science are wrong and falling apart, but in reality we see impressive technological development, how does this work out? After all, we are told that technology developed on the basis of the theory of relativity and on the basis of quantum mechanics. Well, when we really look at the body of things, it turns out that technology developed on the basis of the photoelectric effect, on the basis of the relationship between energy, mass, and the speed of light, which is not the only relationship, and on the basis of frequencies. Technology could have developed, and even easily, even without the stories of special and general relativity, and also without the stories of uncertainty and the like of quantum mechanics, stories that are ultimately nothing but mumbo-jumbo that has been going on for 120 years. And now, having said that, it is time to prove them and to present an alternative. This alternative will not stand as another cult, but as a scientific alternative, a doctrine of everything that will stand from now on as long as it is not refuted, if it is refuted. The path to the doctrine of everything, crossing the Rubicon 2025, passes through the failures of doctrines that cannot be unified because they are wrong. It passes through the question of why, through the finger that stops the disaster in the dam, and through supreme intelligence and courageous leadership, according to it. Supreme intelligence that the potential for is in each and every one of us, and not in any convention, not in any cult, and not in any religious cult sages of any kind. Breaking, question, solution. The three elements of the breakthrough. Why, a finger in the dam, and the supreme intelligent leadership of each and every one of us. This is the human spirit that is supposed to lead humanity to the stars outside and the stars inside. And to begin this fantastic journey to the stars and back, the wonderful journey to the theory of everything, it is appropriate to trace the failed path that led to the two central teachings of non-rational, subjective science, a science that turned from an intelligent science into a subjective religion, the theory of special and general relativity and quantum mechanics. When we observe the evolution that led to Einstein's theory of special and general relativity, a wonderful development is revealed to us. A development that began in the 1830s and ended at the beginning of the 20th century, between 1905 and 1915. Everything that has happened since then, in science and physics, has practically also been integrated into philosophy, law, politics, values, and art, in the essence of modern man. And the reason for this is simple. The claim about the relativity of time and space fits in well with the claim about the relativity of truth, that there is no absolute truth to strive for, that everything is relative. So too do quantum mechanics, with regard to uncertainty, absurdity, meaninglessness, chance, and the idea that it is the human observer who decides what reality is, who determines how reality looks. All these erroneous explanations of reality went well together. As they say, the stars aligned, along with the decline of both philosophy and faith. This history begins in the 1830s, when the scientist James Clerk Maxwell unified the vacuum constant of the electric field and the vacuum constant of the magnetic field, that is, between the potentials of these two fields. When Maxwell unified these two constants, that is, multiplied them by a certain formula, the result obtained is exactly equal to the speed of light in a vacuum. In 1887, the scientists Michelson and Morley tested, in a famous experiment, the relationship between the speed of light, a constant determined according to Maxwell's formula, and the ether, which was considered at the time to be the mediating factor in the existence of light. Why? Because they believed that no wave could propagate in space without there being something in this space. And if the wave propagates in a space in which there is a medium, such as the ether, then that medium must affect the light. That is, it must slow it down. Therefore, Michelson and Morley wanted to test whether the ether does indeed affect light. In their famous experiment from 1887, they tested one arm of light, moving in the direction of the Earth's motion, against another arm of light perpendicular to the direction of the Earth's motion. In this way, they wanted to test what would happen when the arm of light parallel to the Earth's motion left a certain point and returned to it, exactly the same distance as the arm of light perpendicular to the motion. To their amazement, it turned out that the light arrived at both arms at exactly the same time, a finding that seemingly denied the existence of the ether, which was supposed to cause a difference between the speed of light parallel to the Earth's motion and the speed of light perpendicular to it. To try to resolve this contradiction, which was perceived as a fundamental contradiction for understanding the universe, mathematician Hendrik Lorentz decided to look at the experiment and observation in an innovative, brilliant, and astonishing mathematical way. In front of him stood two arms of light, one horizontal and one vertical, in both of which the same speed of light was measured, and he nevertheless sought to prove the existence of the ether. To this end, Lorentz set up a new equation, within the framework of which he distinguished between the time and distance that the stationary observer sees, two equal arms, and the time and distance of someone who is supposedly inside the light of someone who is moving at the speed of light. In this equation, the time component of the moving observer is lengthened, and the space component is shortened. Lorentz's explanation was that it is not time itself that lengthens, but that the clock that measures it slows down due to the physical effect of its presence in the ether. At the same time, the space or length is shortened because physical forces of the ether affect it in a way that shortens it. In doing so, Lorentz established an equation in which the constant speed of light, the equal lengths of the arms, and the existence of the ether was simultaneously preserved, a clear attempt to square the circle. The young student Albert Einstein arrived at this reality and said, "Wait, if Lorentz's formula works, if the arms are equal, if there is no ether that shortens the traveler's space and slows down his clocks, and if the laws of physics hold, then the logical conclusion is that the mathematical model itself is reality. According to Einstein, the ether does not exist, and therefore time itself lengthens and space itself shortens. This leads to a revolution in humanity's perception of reality. Not constant time, but relative time. Not constant space, but relative space. And this is precisely where the double and persistent error lies. Instead of concluding from Michelson and Morley's experiment that the ether does not exist, an artificial and problematic mathematical formula of Lorentz was put forward. And after it became clear that the ether does not exist, instead of looking for another model, Einstein turned that artificial formula, which was intended to save a non-existent entity, into reality itself, without asking what time is, what space is, and without checking whether there is an alternative that does not contradict the laws of physics and does not impose on reality what is not in it. This move is reminiscent of Einstein's move against Planck, for which he received the Nobel Prize. Regarding the issue of light as a quantum raised by Planck, Planck believed that this was an artificial model and not reality. Einstein, in his genius, turned the model into reality, but against an existing object, light itself. In contrast, Einstein's error regarding Lorentz was that he turned an artificial model intended to save an object that does not exist at all, the ether, into reality. Hence, the double error. This error continued from the special theory of relativity to the general theory of relativity to the idea of curved space-time, to the cancellation of gravity, and became error upon error. As mentioned within the framework of these fantastic brilliances, Einstein also came to the insight that light is not continuous but acts in portions, in quanta, the photoelectric effect, for which he received the Nobel Prize. On the other hand, the famous formula that Einstein arrived at, E equals mc squared, and which was set forth in the fourth article of the special theory of relativity, is not required by the theory of relativity itself at all, and is not in itself a correct formula. Sixth article, let's look at the error. Well, E is equal to mc squared, according to the result of the last article of Einstein's Year of Wonders, the fourth article. However, this result is not accurate, even according to current conventional science. According to the currently accepted formulation, E squared is equal to mc squared squared plus pc squared. And why? Because otherwise the claim that light carries energy cannot be sustained. After all, according to current science, light is a massless photon, and if it has no mass, then according to E equal to mc squared, its energy should be zero. However, according to current science, the energy of the photon is not zero. It carries energy, and therefore it must be measured using its frequency multiplied by the speed of light. In other words, if the mass is zero, what remains is the frequency and the speed of light. Hence the formula, E squared is equal to mc squared, squared plus pc squared. From these things, it follows that the claim of a direct correlation between mass and energy, the claim that it is mass at rest and so on, is fundamentally wrong. Mass is not created from mere energy, and it is not created from a mere field. It is true that within mass there is enormous energy, but this does not mean, neither logically nor practically, that mass is created from pure energy per se. In any case, from this formula, it is certainly not possible to conclude that the mass contained in energy can be created from pure energy. E is a measure of what is in mass. It is not an independent entity that creates mass. Later, we will also see things in the context of fields and in the context of the serious error of modern conventional science, according to which mass is created from a field, from excitation in a field. In other words, from a field whose origin is unknown and from where it comes, matter was created. This is an error that continues the chain of errors of the two central masters of modern conventional science, a science that went from error to error to error until the moment of correction arrived. Well, just as 1905 was the year of the breakthrough of the special theory of relativity and later of the general theory of relativity, it was also, in fact, the common denominator from which the historical separation between the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics occurred. And why? Because that paper, among Einstein's 4 papers from 1905, on the basis of which he was awarded the Nobel Prize, is the paper required for the photoelectric phenomenon, that is, for the phenomenon of light operating in packets, operating in frequencies, operating in quanta, when it carries electromagnetic energy. However, Einstein saw quantumness as a unique phenomenon of light, while reality itself is for him a continuous reality subject to the laws of nature, with the same dimension of space-time, and with the same dimension of both time change and space change. In 1924, a young man submitted his doctoral thesis to the University of Paris, in which he formulated a hypothesis that is now known by his name, the de Broglie hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, not only light has wave properties, but every particle in existence, the electron, and later also other particles that were supposedly discovered. But if every particle has wave properties, then the whole of reality is not a continuous reality. Then the whole of reality passes, ostensibly, into other dimensions, the quantum dimension, from which a fundamental difficulty arises. This dimension, as we shall see, does not act on the whole of reality, but ostensibly only on the smallest elements of reality. And beyond a certain size, it simply ceases to act. That doctoral thesis by de Broglie is in fact the breaking point between Einstein and the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. These are the two pillars on which modern physics rests, on which modern observation of the universe rests. And these two pillars, almost all of them, are fundamentally wrong. Within the framework of that development of quantum theory and particle theory, additional particles that were previously unknown began to be discovered, supposedly. As part of the understanding of reality, it is claimed that the most fundamental particles that have been discovered are the quarks, which make up the proton and the neutron. According to the model, these quarks are in a state of sticking that cannot be separated, together with additional particles called gluons. According to this model, gluons carry the strong force, while quarks carry partial charges, 2/3, 1/3, and so on, and at the same time are also attributed a color, linking them to the strong force. Thus, a theory of particles and more particles developed each time they failed to explain observations in reality within the framework of quantum mechanics. If, for example, a normal phenomenon was observed in nature in which a free neutron decays into a proton, an electron, and something else, attempts were made to explain this using a new force called the weak force. And if there is a force, the weak nuclear force, that causes the neutron to decay into a proton and so on, then according to modular logic, there must also be a particle that carries the weak nuclear force and performs this operation. The same goes in the opposite direction, which is much rarer, a process that occurs in 1 in 10 to the 22nd power, in a certain element of xenon that transforms into another element. That is, a transition from 54 protons and electrons and 70 neutrons to 72 neutrons and 52 protons and 52 electrons. This is an extremely rare phenomenon in nature, and it too has been explained by particles that carry the weak force, the weak nuclear force. And so, within the framework of that observation of the small dimensions of the universe, more and more particles were added. The photons, W particles, Z particles, the neutrino, the Higgs particle, which, according to the claim, is supposed to establish mass, and so on and so forth. And when did those particles appear? Precisely at the moments when we observed reality using a certain model and saw that reality did not fit with it. Then additional particles were introduced. Where did those particles come from? That is a good question. The lion's share of them coming from nowhere. They simply appeared suddenly, and after the process in which they participated, they were as if they had not been, and all of them together neither existed nor were they created. When we look at Einstein's special and general theories of relativity and the quantum theory opposite it, it becomes clear that these are two theories that separated from the same common starting point: light acting in packets within the framework of the photoelectric effect. They separated from each other because the theory of relativity does not operate in the framework of particles, does not operate in the small dimensions of reality. There, it collapses. On the other hand, quantum mechanics does not operate in the large framework. It stops at a certain size, a very small size, and beyond. Thus, two theories were created here. A separation was created between two theories that were supposedly the central theories for understanding the universe. These separate trends of the two masters deepened until a situation was created in which every time one of the theories encountered a phenomenon or observation that did not agree with it, new models were developed to continue and sustain it. That is, if the theory of relativity does not work in the framework of small particles, we have quantum mechanics, and if the theory of relativity does not work in the framework of the Big Bang, does not work in the face of black holes, and does not work in the face of the expansion of the universe, then new components are invented to make it work. Dark matter that causes the universe not to collapse. Additional constants that will allow both expansion and non-collapse, and so on and so forth. And so on in quantum mechanics. If something does not work, we say that there is uncertainty. If a phenomenon is seen that appears as both a particle and a wave, we say that it is both a particle and a wave. If we fail to measure the behavior of the small particle, we say that it is not possible to measure, that there is a probability here, that the observer is the one who determines what the outcome will be, and so on. And if there is an unexplained phenomenon in quantum reality, we invent new particles that operate in complete contradiction to the laws of nature. And all this instead of addressing the foundations of science, the foundations of scientific observation. And the basis of scientific observation is simple. If a certain theory does not work, we must check whether it is not a false theory. As Karl Popper says, every scientific theory is a refutable theory, and if it is a theory that cannot be refutable, then it is not a scientific theory. It is very simple. When there is a theory that does not fit with reality, and we repeatedly force reality so that the theory remains valid, we move from error to error to error. In the end, we find ourselves with two masters who have developed as error upon error upon error. And what does this remind us of? It reminds us of moral philosophical development. It reminds us of religious development, error after error after error. And there is a correlation between these and these. Why? Because, as mentioned, it is very convenient in modern times to remain, so to speak, with a relatively true theory. It is convenient to stay with the theory of uncertainty, with the theory of chance. This fits well with concepts of absurdity, ambiguity, the relativity of truth. Truth determined by each individual, personal truth, rather than general truth, and so on. But there is one small thing that does not fit, neither here nor here. The very theories that lead to these conclusions are fundamentally wrong theories. This is what rational science says. A theory that does not fit with reality, the theory must be tested, not to add one more element after another to make it work, but first to test whether the theory itself is true or false. First, when Lorentz sought to explain the phenomenon of light, he did so within the framework of the reality of ether. Why? Because according to his method, it was impossible to understand a wave phenomenon, and in general, the material occurrences in reality without the existence of some intermediary entity. In contrast with Einstein, the ether was removed from the picture, and in its place was the reality of space-time. This reality includes gravity, the development of waves, frequencies, fields, and other phenomena. However, here too, the same fundamental question arises. Why? If we remove the concept of space-time, a mere negation is not enough. An alternative model must be placed in its place, a model that will explain those phenomena that must occur within the framework of some physical reality that mediates between them. The general and framework explanation for this is the theory of the center. According to the theory of the center, the universe is not a balloon that inflates from a point that no longer exists, but a physical reality that began from a certain point that remains in existence at the center of the universe. Around this point, the entire universe revolves by means of the phenomena of attraction and repulsion between its parts. This results in an ordered and rotating universe, and not a universe that expands to infinity in a boundless manner. At this point, we must do what neither Einstein nor others did: ask the fundamental question, why? Why is there space-time? Not because it fits into certain formulas, which in any case do not fit with either the small or the large reality, but because we must first understand what time and what space are. When we understand what time and what space are, we can examine whether there can indeed be an entity of space-time that can be curved, folded, or moved back and forth in it. A thorough conceptual examination reveals that time and space are not independent entities in themselves. Here, for the purpose of discussion, we must set aside the question of space at the moment of the Big Bang and before it, and look at the space found within the universe after the Big Bang. Space in the universe is not an entity in itself, but a measurement of relationships between substances. Time in the universe is not an entity in itself, but a measurement of a phenomenon between cause and effect. Therefore, these two dimensions, space and time, are not independent ontological entities, but rather means of measuring phenomena in reality per se. From this follows a fundamental conclusion. In order to understand reality, space and time should not be treated as independent entities, but rather one must return to what is measured by them, to the forces, to the materials, and to the relationships between them, and from this understand the natural reality of the universe. Say from now on, we are indeed in a reality of particles, fields, and forces, but this is not a reality of an ether nor of space-time. It is a reality of a central point, of a central rotation, of a central force, and of a central field, all of them together as the physical foundations for understanding the structure of the universe. According to modern scientific convention, physical reality began with a primordial state in which a single central force existed, from which the four fundamental forces split. First, the strong nuclear force versus the electromagnetic and weak forces, and then the separation of these into the electromagnetic and weak forces, and then also into the gravitational force, or, in Einstein's formulation, the curvature of space-time. These forces, which were expressed as fields, supposedly gave rise to particles in what is known as excitation, with the primary elementary particles being quarks, gluons, electrons, and photons, and later the WZ and Higgs bosons also being charged. According to this description, within the framework of that initial explosion, those quarks and gluons united through a mechanism of inseparable gluing, and from them, protons and neutrons were created. After about 380,000 years, as the temperature dropped and the universe expanded, the light, photons, could break out, and atoms and molecules were formed, and that stage is recorded by convention through the cosmic background radiation. Deep flaws are already evident in the very foundations of this description, and as we will see later, even modern experiments do not resolve them, but rather amplify them. Firstly, the claim that in the beginning there were fields and forces, and from them particles were born, is a fundamentally wrong claim. This error stems directly from the misinterpretation of the formula E equals mc squared. The formula E equals mc squared has been interpreted as a claim that mass can be created from pure energy, meaning that matter is created from nothing. But this is not its physical meaning. Even according to conventional physics itself, the full formula is at least E squared equals m squared c to the fourth power plus p squared c squared. And this formula does not prove the creation of mass from energy, but at most describes a claim for energy stored in existing mass and its momentum. Mass stores energy, but is not created from energy. Energy is not an entity that creates matter, but a measure of what is already present in mass. According to modern convention, matter, the particles themselves, were created not from matter, but from a field. That is, in practice, matter was created from nothing. But this claim is inconsistent with the laws of physics themselves. If it is inconsistent with the laws of physics, the contradiction cannot be worked around using additional models, but a basic scientific assumption must be made. It is an error. Hence, another model is required, a model in which matter is created from something, not from nothing, but not forever, but within a being that has a beginning, structure, and direction. This is already a deeper dimension of thought, a dimension in which rational science, rational morality, and rational faith are not disconnected from each other. When we separate these dimensions, we get the situation we have here: the absence of true science, the absence of true morality, and the absence of true faith, all at once. Scientific convention presents a reality in which particles are created from fields, mass is created from energy, and matter emanates from spirit, from force. But beyond the conceptual fallacy, there is an even more serious physical problem here. If at the beginning of the universe there were enormous densities, extreme energies, and an enormous cosmic impulse, then under such conditions no structure unites. Everything falls apart. Unification occurs only when the conditions of impulse and density weaken, not at their peak. This is evident even in a simple experiment. When a rocket is launched from Earth under extreme thrust, nothing unites. Everything is subject to disintegration. Reunification occurs only after the thrust decreases, not during it. Therefore, the description of the formation of stable structures precisely in the midst of the violent thrust of the Big Bang, in the evolution of separation, union, separation, and then union does not correspond to the known laws of nature, but contradicts them. Not disintegration of fields to union of particles to disintegration, or non-binding of particles to union of particles, but rather disintegration to disintegration to disintegration, and then union, and so on, as we will see later. We will now examine one of the central pillars of quantum mechanics in its material sense, those elementary particles that, according to quantum theory, sustain the center of quantum behavior, the quarks, gluons, and electrons. According to the conventional model, quarks are three particles that make up the proton and neutron. They are attributed a mass that is significantly greater than the mass of the electron, as well as a partial electric charge, which when combined results in a total charge of +1 in the proton or 0 charge in the neutron. In addition, they are attributed a property called color, which links them to the carriers of the strong force, the gluons, inside the proton and neutron. This theory is based primarily on electromagnetic observation of protons, in which three foci were observed, a central focus and two side foci. However, this is not a direct measurement of the charge of the quarks themselves, nor a direct measurement of mass. Concepts such as color are not observable at all in electromagnetic observation, but are the product of a mathematical model only. Beyond the aforementioned electromagnetic observation, no other experimental observation has been made that verifies the existence of quarks as independent physical entities. The same three foci are found in similar foci in a proton, center, and two sides, but never in the same exact location when there is no single proton measured as a single entity, but rather these are statistical measurements of billions of protons. Nevertheless, all protons are identical to each other in mass and charge, just as each electron is identical to another electron, and each neutron is identical to another neutron in these aspects. Furthermore, no experiment has been performed that has tested the claim that the neutron is composed of three quarks with different charges. Based solely on electromagnetic observation in the proton, a mathematical model of three quarks, accompanied by gluons, moving at speeds close to the speed of light in both the proton and the neutron, was constructed. This model raises a fundamental physical question. How is a constant mass and stable observation obtained from such a dynamic, chaotic, and fast reality? This alleged reality is incompatible with physical logic and the laws of nature. This situation did not lead conventional physics to re-examine the foundations of the model, but rather the opposite. Particle-accelerated experiments, instead of indicating the collapse of quark theory, served as a basis for adding more and more particles. In all those experiments, whether in proton-antiproton, proton-proton, or other experiments, the observed result, whether direct or indirect, was always the appearance of electrons or positrons with a certain mass. There was never any direct decay into quarks, nor was there any observation of free quarks as a product of the decay of a proton or neutron. Faced with this observational reality, in which the decay of protons and neutrons leads to electrons, positrons, and sometimes something else, but never quarks, conventional physics did not see this as a refutation of the quark theory, claiming that they are never united with gluons, etc. However, in fact, it is a direct refutation of the model. The reason for this is simple. There is no physical scenario in which quarks can unite and become an electron or a positron. Not in terms of gluons, which are not perceived as entities that can be separated from quarks, not in terms of the mass attributed to quarks, which is greater than the mass of the electron, etc. Therefore, quarks cannot be a source of an electron or a positron. And here, the results of all experiments on the decay of protons and neutrons do not lead exclusively to electrons, positrons, but sometimes also to something else, which was explained by adding an additional particle, the neutrino, in order to preserve the principle of conservation of energy. Hence the clear conclusion. All experiments do not strengthen the theory of quarks and gluons, but rather prove unequivocally that it is a fundamentally wrong theory. We will now turn to observing the principle of particle-wave duality, which is one of the central elements of quantum mechanics. We have already seen that the material basis of this theory is an incorrect one, and we will see this later in relation to other particles such as W, Z, and others, all of which constitute mathematical models deduced from observations in order to preserve the fundamental model of quarks and quantum mechanics, models that are in themselves incorrect. When we look at the principle of particle-wave duality, and at the point of separation between Einstein and the continuous reality and the particle quantum reality, a reality of packets, of frequencies, and so on. The same fundamental error is revealed both in Einstein and in quantum mechanics. The reason for this lies in a misunderstanding of the relationship between a particle and a field. We will examine this using the basic example of the electron. It is known that the electron has a radial electric field, a static field that acts in the form of rays that emanate from the electron in all directions, are perpendicular to it, and continue to infinity. Although the energy intensity decreases with distance, it decreases asymptotically and never disappears. Therefore, the electron's field is a continuous and persistent field. When the electron is in motion, another field is added to the electric field, the magnetic field. This results in the electromagnetic field of the electron and in parallel also of the positron, but in opposite directions of the fields. Here lies the source of the confusion. The field is related to the particle in a necessary connection. There is no field without a particle, and there is no field that creates a particle. The field is a property of the particle, and it arises from it. The particle itself is not a wave, but its field behaves like a wave. Therefore, there is no contradiction between a particle and a wave. The wave is not the particle itself, but a phenomenon of the particle's field. When energy is added to the system, a phenomenon called a photon appears, which is devoid of mass. However, this is not an independent particle in the material sense, but a phenomenon that occurs on top of the particle's field. Thus, the photon that is conventionally perceived as a particle does not exist at all. Light is not a particle that is also a wave, paradoxically, but is a wave expression of a phenomenon in the particle's field. Thus, a clear unity is obtained. A particle and a field are united together. The particle is the source of the field, and the field behaves like a wave during phenomena within it. In motion, or with the addition of energy, a wave phenomenon is obtained, without attributing a wave nature to the particle itself. The things are true for both the negatively charged electron and the positively charged positron. Therefore, there is no contradiction between the reality of continuous particles and the reality of packets and frequencies. Reality is one. Matter and field are united together, and waves are an expression of the fields of matter, spirit and matter alike, without false duality and without artificial paradox. Article 7. Being Karl Popper. Well, in 1934, Professor Karl Popper published his famous book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery. In this book, Popper presented his fundamental principle, according to which a theory is a scientific theory if and only if it is falsifiable. That is, if there is a principled possibility of putting it to the test of observations or experiments that may refute it. According to Popper, scientific progress is not achieved through an inductive process, that is, by accumulating observations and deriving a theory from them, but rather by positing a bold hypothesis that becomes a theory, which is tested against reality, against experiments, and against observations. This theory stands as long as it is not logically refuted by the observations. In simple terms, if a certain theory is true, we expect observation X. If in fact we observe non-X, the theory is refuted and falls, and a new theory must be put in its place. The new theory, according to Popper, should be not only falsifiable, but also more informative than its predecessor. At the heart of Popper's view is the notion that science repeatedly advances toward the truth, although it will never attain it with certainty and absolute certainty. It is a constant striving for objectivity, an approach to a truth that will never be fully attained. by replacing refuted theories with bolder and better theories. Against this position of Karl Popper, an early and significant criticism was leveled by Pierre Duhem in 1906 in his book The Aim and Structure of Physical Theory. Duhem argued that it is not possible to test a single theory by means of a single case or a single observation. According to him, refutation never operates against an isolated theory, but against a set of assumptions underlying it. That is, when a particular observation contradicts a theory, this does not necessarily mean that the theory itself is wrong. The flaw may lie in one of the background assumptions, in one of the auxiliary assumptions, or in the accompanying theoretical framework. In 1951, Willard Van Orman Quine developed this line of thought in his book Two Dogmas of Empiricism, and took it to a more radical position against Popper. Quine argued that when a theoretical thesis is obscured, it is impossible to determine with certainty which component of the thesis has failed. That is, there is no sharp and clear way to distinguish between the core of the theory and its auxiliary assumptions. According to Quine, Popper's position is too inclusive and even naive, since it does not distinguish between central, comprehensive, and important theories and specific components within those theories. It ignores the complexity of an entire theoretical system. Furthermore, Quine argued that a study of the history of science shows that adopting Popper's approach strictly would have prevented scientific progress. For example, he claims that Galileo would not have adopted Copernicus because at that time there were many observations that allegedly contradicted the heliocentric model. From this, Quine concludes that central theories, such as those of Newton or Einstein, were in fact protected from immediate refutation and were not overthrown because of one or two contradictory observations. According to Quine and Duhem together, science does not progress according to the simple Popperian model. When an observation appears that does not fit with a central theory, the entire theory should not be immediately overthrown, but rather one should examine where the error lies, in some component of the theoretical system, and try to correct it instead of rejecting the central theory itself. It should be noted here that this is a problematic narrative that is perhaps aimed at an institutional goal according to which, according to Popper, one observation is enough to overthrow an entire theory, and that's it. A proper observation about Popper would be that repeated tests of both the observation and the theory should be required until logical certainty is formed that is also refutable, as opposed to the ignorance that distinguishes between the overall theory that is not tested and its parts that are tested separately from it. It seems that after the radical clash between the Duhem-Quine position and the position of Karl Popper, Professor Thomas Kuhn appeared in 1962 and supposedly offered an intermediate approach as part of his well-known book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn claims that science in the past developed within a pre-paradigmatic period, while modern science develops within paradigms. And what is a paradigm? A paradigm is a comprehensive system of basic assumptions, problems, and accepted solutions. That is, a frame of mind shared by the dominant scientific community. According to Kuhn, scientific development occurs within an existing paradigm, within a period he calls normal science. During the period of normal science, there is no attempt to challenge the paradigm itself or the central theory. An important theory, as defined by Quine, is not a candidate for refutation, but serves as a framework within which specific problems are solved. The experiments are not refutation experiments in Popper's sense, but rather solution experiments, attempts to resolve difficulties and anomalies within the framework of that paradigm. According to Kuhn, Modern science no longer operates in a pre-paradigmatic state, but within periods of stable paradigms, governed by shared assumptions and an accepted scientific community. This is a state of normal science. And when did Karl Popper enter the picture? According to Kuhn, Popper is activated only when the paradigm itself collapses, an exceptional and rare event, when too many anomalies accumulate that can no longer be resolved within the existing paradigm. Then, and only then, does a scientific revolution occur. One paradigm falls, and a new paradigm, a new overall theory, arises in its place, and a new period of normal science begins. Thus, according to Kuhn, science progresses in cycles, a stable paradigm, accumulation of anomalies, a scientific revolution, a new paradigm, and then again. Scientific revolutions are rare, from Newton to Einstein, and from Einstein to the present day. It seems that according to Kuhn, we have been within the same dual paradigm for about 120 years. Einstein's theory of relativity on the one hand, and the quantum mechanics of Planck, de Broglie, Bohr, Heisenberg, Higgs, and others on the other. But the approach of Doom, Quinn, and Kuhn is also an extremely problematic one. Why? Because there is a fundamental difference between a historical description of how science developed and the transformation of this description into a binding norm, a doctrine that must be followed. The main problem is that when the paradigm approach is adopted as a guiding principle, what is actually obtained is a closed system resembling a cult or a subjective religion. The scientific community becomes the factor that determines what is permissible to challenge and what is prohibited, which parts can be corrected, and which parts are sacred and immune from refutation. In such a situation, the central theory does not stand up to a real test, but only specific corrections are permitted, at the discretion of the dominant scientific community. This is a mechanism that is more reminiscent of a coercive religious system than a scientific doctrine rooted in freedom of research. For example, we can make a historical copy-paste in this regard from the case of Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep IV addresses the priests and the pagan system, which is rich in power, positions, and resources, and tells them, "You are wrong. Instead of hundreds and thousands of gods, there is only one God, the God of the sun." A concept that made a lot of sense for its time, in light of the central role of the sun in the formation of life. This doctrine was met with fierce opposition from the priestly system, as it threatened the centers of power, positions, and control. Immediately after the death of Amenhotep IV, idolatry in ancient Egypt returned, and even more so. And what remains of it today? Only antiquities, not truth. The same is true of science. Whether we look at specific observations or comprehensive theories, science is supposed to operate according to scientific principles and not according to mechanisms of silencing, authority, and the defense of paradigms. Once the approach of normal science is accepted as a binding norm, the scientific community itself becomes the measure of truth. And when the central theory does not match observations, the theory is not tested, but new entities are invented. Dark matter to sustain the theory of relativity, additional constants and variables, and new particles in quantum mechanics, particles that did not exist and were not created, that appear out of nowhere and disappear into nowhere. All of this in complete contradiction to physics and in complete contradiction to the laws of nature. Even if we choose to follow Thomas Kuhn and accept the framework of paradigms and normal science, it still becomes clear that the anomalies in the two fundamental pillars of modern science have accumulated to an extent that can no longer be denied. These are anomalies that are not marginal and not isolated, but rather ones that strike at the very heart of each of the theories. When we look at the theory of relativity, it becomes clear that it does not work at the level of elementary particles in small reality, but the problem does not end there. The theory of relativity also does not work in large reality. It does not provide a coherent description of the Big Bang. It does not stand at the singular point of black holes, and it does not consistently explain the non-collapse of the universe. Even in these fundamental senses, the theory simply does not work. A parallel observation of quantum mechanics leads to a similar conclusion. It also does not operate in the natural reality beyond the dimension of small particles. From a certain limit onwards, it collapses. But instead of asking whether this collapse indicates a fundamental error in the theory itself, we continue to develop it more and more. Thus, we are presented with a reality of uncertainty, of chance, of matter that is also spirit, of entities that are simultaneously in the same place, and of the claim that the observer influences the very outcome of the experiment. To this are added particles that do not fit with observations and the fundamental laws of physics. Not the quarks, not the gluons, not the Higgs, W and Z particles, nor other particles that have been proposed. And instead of stopping and re-examining the foundations of the theory, instead of positing a real alternative to these two masters, another alternative theory, they try to unite them by force into a theory of everything. This is how theories such as string theory and the like are born, which in the end are nothing more than a continuation of error upon error, and even more so, an attempt to unify two central theories that are not valid from the start, theories that the scientific community clings to even though they do not hold up against the most fundamental observations of the universe. Article 8. Changing the guards. It's time to replace the two pillars of errors. Therefore, even if we choose to follow Kuhn, although I have reservations about his approach, and certainly if we follow Popper, the conclusion is clear. The two foundational pillars of modern science, Einstein's theory of relativity, special and general, and quantum mechanics on the assumptions of uncertainty, chance, and the ad hoc multiplicity of particles, and more, can no longer be held as foundational theories. This is not a matter of needing internal correction or point adjustments, but of the need for a complete replacement of the two pillars themselves. To move towards a theory of everything, we must return to the basics. The laws of nature exist, are muscular and universal. Causal logic remains the same. There is no particle without a field, and no field without a particle. Time is not an independent entity, and therefore does not change and is not relative, and neither is space. From these foundations, it follows directly that the speed of light is not a supreme speed in principle. The claim regarding the limit to the speed of light exists solely to uphold the theory of relativity. Since the special and general theories of relativity do not hold, the limit to the speed of light also falls with them. The speed of light, as Maxwell shows, is a derivative result of the electric field and the magnetic field of the electromagnetic field, that is, of the product of their potentials, and not an ontological limit of reality. But we know that beyond the electromagnetic force, that beyond the electromagnetic field, there is another force, which is stronger than the electromagnetic force, even according to scientific convention, immeasurably. As we recall, according to scientific convention, there are three additional forces: the nuclear force, which is incomparably stronger than the electromagnetic force, the weak nuclear force, and gravity, or according to Einstein, the curvature of space-time. As we will see later, this entire division into forces is also fundamentally incorrect and is directly related to errors in observing the highest speeds in the universe. So let's look at the beginning. According to Occam's razor, a simpler, more consistent theory, one that is consistent with observations in both subatomic and cosmic reality, should be preferred over a complex theory that is inconsistent with neither. The theory of relativity does not operate in either small or large space. Quantum mechanics does not operate beyond the dimension of tiny particles. Instead of adding more and more unobserved entities, dark matter, temporary particles, mathematical constants, an alternative, simpler, and of course, falsifiable, fundamental theory should be established. From the principles presented, an unambiguous conclusion emerges. The universe cannot begin with a force or fields, with one force that splits into several forces and from which particles are created. The formula E equals mc squared is not a fundamental formula of reality. Energy does not give rise to mass. Mass stores energy, but energy does not create mass. A field does not give rise to matter, and no matter is created out of nothing. Instead of the conventional picture of a multitude of fields, forces, and particles, a completely different picture is proposed here. The Big Bang gives rise to only one fundamental particle with mass, which includes within it one force field. This particle will be called by Dr. Alon Giladi the adatron. The name adatron was chosen from a combination of meanings, of knowledge, of the purpose of knowing, of pure reason, or in Hebrew, of the adda, of pure rational faith, adhe, for those who believe, and beyond that, because there is a personal aspect here, because the name of Dr. Alon Giladi's wonderful mother was Ada. The adatron is the fundamental particle, the source of the fundamental particles, forces, and fields that shape the entire universe from its beginning until now. If we examine the conventional division of the stages of the Big Bang, according to Planck, a division that also requires re-examination, starting from densities of 10 to the power of 96 to densities of lower orders of magnitude, where by convention the forces appear and the central force splits into the strong nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, the weak nuclear force, and then gravity. Then, according to the view proposed here, this is an incorrect description of reality. In the physical reality described here, the elementary particle, the advatrons, which are identical to each other, are what sustain the foundation of the universe derived from the Big Bang. They are the ones that sustain the central point that remained after the Big Bang at the center of the universe, and they are the ones that sustain that part that separated from the central point, and which, as soon as the density allowed it, disintegrated into the fundamental particles and fundamental forces that subsequently build the universe. As we recall, if we observe experiments that disintegrate the proton, we always see, at the end of the process, a positron. And as mentioned, a positron cannot be formed from quarks, cannot be formed from a combination of quarks. Therefore, the fundamental particle found in the proton is the positron, not the quarks or the gluons. It is the positron and something else. When the advatron disintegrates at the first density that allows this, on the order of 10 to the 38th power, it disintegrates into three fundamental particles, a positron, an electron, and another particle that is the carrier of the central force, which will be called an alphatron. These three particles, alphatron, positron, and electron, constitute the foundation of matter and the forces fields of the universe beyond the central point. The adatron thus breaks down into three particles and only two forces, the only two forces that exist in nature, the central force and the electromagnetic force, not the strong nuclear force, not the weak nuclear force, not gravity, and not the curvature of space-time, but only two fundamental forces, the central force and the electromagnetic force attached to the particle lineage. At the moment of initial separation, therefore, two forces and three particles exist, and this is the entire physical basis of the universe. No additional forces are needed, and no additional particles are needed to explain the structure of reality. In the initial stage, a reality of neutrons is obtained, and then the neutrons decay into protons and electrons in the reality of alphatron, positron, and electron, and from there, according to the current model, which also needs to be tested, into light and the union of elementary atoms and the other atoms to create the universe that is revealed to us at this stage. When we look at quantum mechanics and find uncertainties, coincidences, and observations that cancel out beyond certain ranges, it is not necessary to explain this by means of a collapse of the laws of nature or by means of a non-deterministic reality. Moreover, it is not correct to do so. The explanation here is fundamentally different. Starting from the moment of the Big Bang, beyond the central point, physical reality is built from three particles and only two forces. There is no changing time, no changing space, and the speed of light is not a universal maximum speed. The speed of light is not a physical limit, but a derivative of the electromagnetic field only, and it represents the lowest fast potential among the forces operating in nature. The universe described here consists of three particles that arise from one elementary particle and two forces that arise from one elementary force. Of these two forces, the central force is the stronger, and it embodies the potential for high speeds that are orders of magnitude higher than the speed derived from the electromagnetic potential. What is conventionally called the strong force is nothing more than a particular local case of that central force. When we observe a proton, we see that in every one of its disintegrations, direct or indirect, a positron is ultimately obtained. This implies that the proton is not composed of three quarks and gluons, but of a positron and an alphatron. The alphatron has a very tiny mass, close to zero, but not zero, and it creates a central rotation around it. Around it, the positron moves at a density of the order of 10 to the 38th power, that is, at speeds that do not exceed the speed of light by 10 or 100 times, but by millions and even billions of times. The positron, which has a greater mass than the alphatron, possesses a property conventionally called color. In practice, this is a link through the central field, which connects the positron's field to the alphatron's field. In addition, it also contains an electromagnetic field. The electron is located outside this structure in the opposite direction and at different distances with a different force significance. Inside the proton, the positron moves around the alphatron, which moves around itself, all at speeds much higher than the speed of light, and it is this motion that produces the three peaks observed in electromagnetic measurements, always a central peak and two side peaks. The three peaks are not evidence of three quarks, but a measurable expression of the rapid cyclic motion of a two-particle system, a central alphatron and a rotating positron. Electromagnetic measurement does not see the particles themselves because of their enormous speeds, but the average interaction of their fields. It follows that the proton is not a chaotic system of particles moving at speeds close to the speed of light randomly, but a stable, deterministic, rotating structure governed by both the central force and the electromagnetic force. In such a structure, there is no need for quarks, no need for gluons, and no need for additional forces or ad hoc particles. There is one legal, simple structure, and it stands up to both observation and physical logic. Three peaks One proton, the rise to the peaks of the universe. Here lies the physical element, and here lies the key to understanding the possibility of true interstellar travel. Not a journey to Mars, but a journey from one end of the Milky Way to the other, to Andromeda and back, and to the distant reaches of the universe. The fundamental energy formula, beyond the central point, is E equals open parenthesis m minus m alpha, close parenthesis, times c squared, plus 1/2 times m alpha times v alpha squared, plus 1/2 times mp times vp squared, plus 1/2 times me times ve squared. The true energy formula is not E equals mc squared, nor E squared equals m squared c to the fourth power plus p squared c squared. It includes the energy contribution of the alphatron, the energy contribution of the positron, and the energy contribution of the electron. We do not currently have the full observational capacity to understand their operation precisely because we have been bound by two masters of theories that have failed, and we have not seen what was lying in front of us all along. Now it's time to step outside the box, to the stars outside, through the stars inside, to the stars and back. Atomic energy is actually residual energy resulting from the interaction between the proton, neutron, and electron. It is not the central, powerful, and fundamental energy through which we will reach the stars. This energy lies in the elementary particles themselves and in the relationships between them. However, in order to reach the outer stars and return, the foundations must be corrected, not only in science, but also in morality and faith. As long as humanity continues on the path it is on today, a path of stagnation, coercive rule, and institutionalized subjectivity, it will deteriorate in science, morality, and faith together, and will not reach either the outer stars or the inner stars. Humanity will not be able to exist for long on the path of atomic power, and even less on the path of the central power if it does not change its ways. From the path of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to the path of the tree of life, to the will to truth. Instead of the will to power, it is appropriate that we now move to the will to truth. The sooner, the better. A will to understand the universe as it is, and to understand what is appropriate in an intelligent, exemplary, and universal way, as the basis for a bright future for all of humanity. There is no field without a particle, and no particle without a field. The speed of light is not the limit, and the universal, causal, and deterministic laws of nature in themselves stand, are strong, and exist. The universe is not an infinitely inflating balloon, but has a central point that I will call the Israeli point, a central point containing most of the mass of the universe, which includes a central force field, the Israeli field, and which rotates around itself in the central Israeli rotation and around which the entire universe rotates. This point is composed of elementary particles that are identical to each other, the adatrons, the central quantity of which remained in the center of the universe and composes it. At the same time, the secondary quantity of the adatrons that separated from the central point disintegrated after the Big Bang, and its products compose the universe through three particles, the alphatron, the positron, and the electron, and two field forces, the strong field force, that is, the residual of the central field force, and the electromagnetic field force. And that's all. To be continued.
All rights reserved to Dr. Alon Giladi.